In this video, I'm going to walk through my process for evaluating my first attempt LLM Judge scores. So quick recap on scoring criteria, eval prompts, and the LLM generation scoring app. I have three categories of scoring criteria. First is foundational language capabilities. We have grammar and context tracking, which the Tiny Stories paper calls consistency. Then I have emergent capabilities of factual knowledge, reasoning, and creativity. And then I have story-related capability of plot. For grammar, I am assessing these 5 criteria. These are taken from the tiny hackathon that I participated in. For context tracking, I have 3 criteria. Grammar, factual knowledge, and reasoning have 1 criteria each. And then creativity has 4 criteria. So in total, I have 18 criteria that I'm evaluating, and plot has 4. So the goal when I was evaluating or generating my evaluation prompts was to generate prompts that either isolate or elicit opportunities to exhibit these scoring categories. So I wanted to isolate factual knowledge, reasoning, and context tracking. And then I wanted to elicit opportunities for the model to exhibit plot and creativity capabilities. For model response, so story completion generation, this is the script I use, making sure padding side is left, making sure I use model red, and doing some checks at the end and using empty cache, which was necessary on the L4, but I've now switched to the A100 to do this, so it's quicker. Something that I'll talk about later is I think I need to change when I use min length, because I don't want to force the model to generate a longer response than it needs to for factual knowledge or reasoning prompts. Here's my current eval prompt set. I have 25 unique prompts for reasoning, 25 unique prompts for factual knowledge, and 25 prompts each for context tracking, plot, and creativity with some overlap. And then I have intentionally overlapped these prompts, 5 prompts sampled from each of the 5 other categories to create my 25 prompts for grammar. So in total, I have 150 total prompts in my eval set. This is the LM scoring app that I created with fast HTML, and I have done a video walkthrough of the code. And this was the first time I've used fast HTML for this purpose. I've done it with Gradio before, and I really enjoyed the process. So from my scoring data or my eval data, I have the category, the prompt, and the completion. And there's 450 prompts because 450 prompt completion pairs because I have 3 models and 150 prompts. And then I have my 6 categories, and then I have the criteria displayed, and I'm scoring on a 0, 0.5, 1.0 level score. And this is taken from the Tiny Stories paper. This is how they evaluate factual prompts, reasoning prompts, and context tracking prompts. So I'm adopting this methodology for all of my criteria, for all my categories. This is a new app I've created. This is the LLM Judge agreement. So this takes the LLM scores for each criterion individually, and it displays it so that I can either agree or disagree with it and leave a comment when I want to make a note to myself that I want to remember, or I'm highlighting something that I want Claude to later analyze. So for example, here the category is grammar. Here's the prompt and completion. Here's the criterion that the LLM Judge is scoring. Here's the score that it gave, and here's the explanation that it provided. So where does this come from? Where does the LLM Judge score and explanation come from? Well, that comes from the LLM Judge prompt that I created. So let's take a look at that. So I used Answer AI's Claudette to generate responses because it's a very easy, provides a very easy API for Claude, and it's just overall very simple to use, and I like its functionality. I'm using Claude Haiku 3.5. So initially just doing a quick test, and this is how you access the actual text of the response. So here's the language model data where this has all the language model generations or completions for all the prompts. And then here is the criteria for each category. And here are the labels that I'm using. And here's the prompt template that I came up with Claude's help. So I have instruction prompt ID, evaluation. I have the initial instruction. I have a rubric with all the criteria listed, as well as the scoring scale and the scoring instruction. Then I have the generation prompt. I have the completion. And then I'm telling it what the response format is. So I want it to give me an evaluation with criterion A score, criterion A explanation, and so on for all the criteria. And then I want it to give me a final score, close the evaluation, close the response format. I repeat the instruction, then I close my prompt. So what is variable across these prompts is the category, and the category has certain criteria associated with it that I went over. So I'm just checking my criteria data set and looking at the category and looking at the criteria for each one. And the way I want to format it is I want to have criterion, ID, whatever the label is, the text of the criterion, and then a closing tag. And then for scores, I want criterion A score, criterion A explanation, etc., depending on how many criteria there are. So first I'm going to handle the contents. So I make a dictionary with empty strings, and then I iterate through my criteria categories, which there are 6. And I get all the criteria for that category. And I basically just make a large string where it's iterating through each row of this criteria subset. And it's constructing a string where I have criterion ID equals the label, close that tag, give me the text of the criterion, and then the closing tag for criterion. And then I'm storing that string in my dictionary. So if I iterate through my dictionary, I have for grammar, I have 5 criterion or criteria. For creativity, I have 4. For plot, I have 4, etc. So I'm just slowly building up my LLM Judge prompt. I do the same thing for the score XML. So I iterate through the categories, I grab the criteria, I iterate through the criteria and grab the label, and that creates the template for the score and explanation instructions. So here it is for grammar, creativity, etc. So now I have the basics of what I'm going to implement. So I'm creating my kind of shell prompt that I'm going to format with criteria content, then the prompt, the completion, and then the criteria score, and then that's it. So if I take the grammar criteria content, give it a test prompt completion pair, and then I pull my criteria scores for grammar in terms of the XML template, I can see here's the 5 criteria correctly formatted. Test prompt, test completion, and then here's the evaluation format correctly formatted. So before I do the whole thing, I'm going to test 5 rows. So it's going to take these 5 prompt completion pairs for grammar. And then I iterate through and just build my prompt template or prompt string. So here's instruction prompt ID, here's the rubric, here's the criteria, here's the generation prompt, here's the completion, here's the evaluation, score, and explanation tags, and then the instruction repeated at the end because that helps models respond. And then I check each of the 5 ones and make sure that the generation prompt and the completion are different each time, which they are. So feeling good so far. Now I'm going to incorporate Haiku. So I make a new chat every time because I don't want the messages to compound. I pass the prompt that I've built, and then I append its response. And I just make sure that I'm using the right model because I don't want the cost to rack up. And then I look at the 5 responses and it looks great. So here's the first one, or I guess the 5th one. So it gave a 0.5 score for criterion A, a 1.0 for criterion B, a 0.0 for criterion C, and so on. And then in each case, it has a nicely formatted explanation, so I can evaluate this later on. And then it gives me a final score, which is the summation of all of these scores. I'm not terribly interested in the final score because I'm going to evaluate at a criterion level. So once that's taken care of, I have a sample of responses now in the format that all the responses will be in. So now I want to parse them. So I'm just going to look at grammar. So I have 5 labels. I have what am I doing here? This is, I don't think I actually end up using this. So we're going to skip that. So I'm going to iterate through the labels. I'm going to build a regex string or pattern. We're going to search for that pattern. And if there is a match, we're going to grab the first match and convert that to a float. So what this is doing is this is grabbing the score 0.0, 0.5, or 1.0. And then I'm doing the same thing for label, except now it's grabbing the string, which is the explanation, and I'm saving that in my dictionary and stripping it of any white space type characters. So here's the result. For grammar, for this prompt, here's the completion, here's the score and explanation for A, score and explanation for B. So this looks good, right? This is what I'm looking for. I can turn it into a data frame, which I'm going to at the end. And here I have my context tracking A score, context tracking A explanation, so on and so forth. Just looking at, yeah, something looks a little funky here. Why is it saying context tracking? I probably forgot to reset the category, so this should actually say grammar, but in the end it turns out okay. Okay, so now we do the whole thing. I iterate through all my rows. I build the prompt. I print the prompt, which I shouldn't have because that filled up the screen. And then I create a new chat, pass it to the model, and then to the responses list, I append the result, the category, the prompt, and the completion. And looking at this, this looks pretty good, and everything was expected. And the benefit of printing the prompt was that it, I could see throughout the generation it took about 50 minutes to do this, and I could take a look, and it looked pretty. It was a nice kind of sanity check, making sure I have 450 responses. I also saved the pickle file, so I have backup, and then I'm just running the same code I had above for extracting the score and explanation, except now I'm iterating through all my responses, and I'm building up a result dictionary and appending it to a list so that when I make a data frame, now I have the really simple to use dictionary or a data frame where it shows me the score, explanation for each of the criteria. It shows me the category, it shows me the prompt and the completion, just as a sanity check. A few more checks. I make sure everything is numeric in terms of the score, and I make sure that the scores are 0.0, 0.5, or 1.0 after dropping NA. I just do a visual inspection of the unique scores. Make sure the prompt is the same as the result prompt that I used. Same thing for completion. And then I save, I'm doing some analysis later on. So that's it for the final results. So this was my process for constructing a LLM Judge prompt and then using Claudette to prompt Claude Haiku 3.5. So let's go back to the presentation. So the first thing I did was I wanted to check and assess what is the overlap between the LLM Judge scores and my manual scores. So I've done a previous video where I walk through how I manually scored the 450 prompt across all of the 18 criteria. And I had my own averages. I compared that to the Tiny Scores paper, and I saw some differences there. So now what I'm doing is I'm seeing, do the LLM Judge and I agree? So the answer to that question depends on what level of granularity you look at. So if we look at overall mean score, it's not exactly the same, but it's not terribly far off. It's somewhere in between. So for the 1 million parameter model, which is actually 3.7 million parameters, it's pretty close, right? 19% to 25% is the overall mean score, right? And I should really say 0.19 and 0.25. It's not really a percentage. For the 8 million / 20 million parameter, we start to see a difference, off by about 0.11. And for the 28 million / 60 million parameter, it's off by 0.1. So here, that's about a 20% difference. Here, that's about a 17% difference. Here, it's about a 25% difference. So the values themselves are not that different, but on average, there's about a 20% difference between the LLM Judge and my scores if we're just looking at the raw score for each prompt completion pair, for each scoring category, for each criterion. So a 20% score difference is okay. It's not great. I'm looking for a 90% or greater alignment, but this let me know that, okay, at least I can work with this and there's some potential. If we look by category, you really start to see the differences. So I've highlighted in red the score differences where there's a significant difference. So for example, if we look at a huge difference for grammar, I judged the manually the 1 million parameter model, and my average score for grammar was about 0.6. The LLM was 0.4, so there's a 50% difference there. For reasoning, I was much more lenient than the LLM Judge, so there's a 3 times score difference. For the 28 million parameter model, which is actually 60 million, for plot, the LLM Judge was more lenient. So again, there's almost a 50% difference there. So it was kind of all over the place, right? It's difficult to tell what's actually going on by looking at these aggregate values, even though now we're looking at it one level deeper than overall mean score. Now I look at it by a criterion. And so this was interesting to see. If we look at the factual knowledge category that has one criterion, the manual score is twice the LLM Judge for the smallest model. And then there's, then it's getting better. So I felt good about this one, about factual knowledge. Reasoning is not as bad for the larger models, but I'm way more lenient for the smallest model. And then this is for creativity, and we can kind of see some of the differences. The LLM Judge is scoring 3 times higher than I am for unique detail. I'm scoring pretty much 0 for fresh situations, whereas it found it at 0.06. I'm scoring it 12 times higher for the completion offers unexpected or novel elements. So this started to raise some questions like, where is this at? What is actually going on? So at this point, I started realizing that doing this sort of aggregate statistical analysis is not really going to help me, other than just show me that, okay, there's some differences. And we see similar trends for grammar at the top here, for context tracking at the bottom. And then this is for plot. We see similar trends where there's significant difference when we look at per model, per criterion, average scores. So the next thing I did was look at the manual score level and look at the LLM Judge alignment. So when I scored a criterion as 1.0, so full success, the LLM Judge matched my score 65% of the time. When I gave it partial success, the LLM Judge matched it 46% of the time. And when I gave it a score of failure, the LLM Judge matched it 61% of the time. So interesting to see. Not a lot I can glean from this. All right, so that was the first level of analysis, but I realized that I'm going to have to actually look at the LLM Judge scores and LLM Judge explanations for every single criterion and see if I agree or disagree. And this is the interface I use. I'll do a separate video where I walk through the code for building this. I felt much more comfortable building this app than the first one. In the first one, I learned a lot. In the second one, I didn't really have to use Claude as much to build this. It was very exciting. So at the top, it shows the index that we're on. So out of 1,350, I can navigate back and forth. I can agree or disagree, and disagree is selected here, and whichever one I have in my store CSV is whichever one that gets selected here. So it kind of has that two-way persistence. There's a comment box, and then there's the prompt, completion, the criterion, and then the LLM Judge score, and then the LLM Judge explanation. So this is the interface I used to agree, disagree, and leave comments. And then what I did at the end is I took that agree, disagree, true, false, and then I took the comments and I gave it to Claude in the browser, and I told it to, give me some trends and tell me where I disagreed with the LLM the most, how I should modify my criteria and how I should modify my prompt. And that really helped me evaluate and improve. Well, at least help me identify and improve. We'll see if the improvements actually work. So what was my main goal, and what was the main takeaway from the alignment exercise? The main thing was I wanted to improve/refine my own manual scoring technique, so how I was grading. I wanted to improve and refine my LLM Judge prompt and instructions. And then I also wanted to improve and refine the actual phrasing of the criteria to fit Haiku's strengths. So some things that I thought would be straightforward were actually not, and vice versa. So let's look at the overall percent agreement. When we look at the overall percent agreement, this is surprising, right? Because the overall agreement in terms of raw scores was around 60%. But when I did the actual, score by score, explanation by explanation evaluation, I realized that I actually agreed with Claude, and it made me realize that my scoring methodology changed as I saw how Claude Haiku 3.5 was scoring. Because many times I would look at its explanation and I would be like, you know what, that actually makes sense. Or it's penalizing certain things that I did, or it's more lenient on certain things where I was stricter. So this was a continuous process of change and improvement. And I was happy to see that I'm close to 90% agreeing with my LLM Judge, which is my target. If we break it down by category, we start to see some differentiation. So factual knowledge and plot were the two highest alignments. So I agreed 97% of the time with Claude's score, with Haiku's score for plot, and 91% of the time for factual knowledge. So, okay, that's great. I don't have to worry about those two. I've hit my target alignment score. And then for context tracking, creativity, and grammar, that was the next tier of 85%. So I felt good. I'm like, okay, I got to get that last 5%. So I think that's doable. The one that I'm concerned about the most is the reasoning criteria category. We only agreed 81% of the time. So I have to get a 10% improvement on that. But I have some ideas on how I can make that possible. So let's now look at each criterion one at a time. So when we're looking at the factual knowledge criterion, there's only one, so there's 91%. If we look at the reasoning criterion, there's only one, so that's 81%. For creativity, character, behavioral, and emotional responses are innovative. That was the lowest scoring prompt. Haiku and I did not agree 25% of the time. And whether the completion contains unique detail, we only agreed 80% of the time. The other two, I feel great. Completion creates fresh situations, 89%. That's close enough to 90%. And the completion offers unexpected or novel elements, 97% alignment. Perfect. You can't really ask for more than that. If we look at foundational capabilities, the biggest difference was grammar, dialogue formatting, and punctuation. So the grammar category and the dialogue formatting and punctuation criterion, 63% alignment. This leads me to believe, and from my experience of looking at Claude Haiku's explanations, it was hallucinating all the time. It was wrong about whether there was a proper capitalization in the dialogue, or whether the punctuation was inside the quote, or whether even there was dialogue. So I realized that I'm pretty sure I'm going to cut this criterion out from my rubric because Haiku just doesn't do well at it. And then the next lowest was, or the second lowest was the age-appropriate vocabulary usage. Oh, actually, sorry, I forgot tense consistency. So tense consistency throughout the completion was the next lowest at 84. and then age-appropriate vocabulary usage at 87. I have some ideas on how to improve that, and I will talk about them at the end. For context tracking, I was surprised that referencing and tracking object characters and their attributes was the lowest criterion. I thought that would be one of the stronger ones. The strongest one was actually completion maintains complete coherence with prompt, where Haiku and I agreed almost at my target level of 90%. And then maintains consistent narrative flow is solid. It could be a little better, but I'm not too worried about that. When we come to plot, across the board, there was full alignment or close to full alignment, with one of the criterion having 100% alignment. So I feel good about this one. Not going to worry about a plot. All right, so let's look at observations and improvements. So the big theme here is I want to prioritize what works over what should work. So the first thing I'm going to do in my next LLM Judge iteration is I'm going to remove criteria where I align with the LLM Judge 80% or less. So character, behavioral, and emotional responses are innovative, dialogue formatting and punctuation, and correctly references tracks all objects, characters, and their attributes. The first two I'm going to delete. The last one I'm going to see if I can combine some of these elements to one of the better performing criteria in context tracking. I want to add an explicit instruction to penalize repetition and to penalize completions where the model generates an EOS token and starts a new story. Haiku was pretty good at doing that, but I think adding an explicit instruction will make it even more consistent. I also think that maintain consistent narrative flow should probably be in the plot category, not in the context tracking category. So I'm going to make that move. That's not really going to change anything, but I just want to make sure that that aligns better with that scoring category. When it comes to the coherence criterion in context tracking, I realized that I didn't take into account the full story, considering it coherent if the prompt if it was coherent at the very start of the completion. So if the completion finishes the sentence correctly and then goes off in incoherence, I consider that coherent, whereas Haiku was a lot more taking a more holistic analysis of the full completion. And then the general kind of vibe I got was that Haiku was more lenient when the criterion is mostly met and less lenient when it isn't met that much. So I feel like it was a lot stricter when it was not very clear. The 81% alignment between me and Haiku for the reasoning prompts, I think is going to be improved after I remove the min length requirement during text generation. So right now I'm requiring the model to generate at least 120 tokens. And that's really not necessary for factual knowledge and reasoning. So I think it's okay if the model only generates 3 or 4 tokens, as long as it finishes the sentence and gives the right answer. Something that I think is going to help across the board, but especially in categories like context tracking and creativity, is adding the instruction, do not evaluate any other aspect of the story other than this criterion. So if it's evaluating criterion A within the same category, I don't want it to think about any other criterion, and I don't want it to think about any other category. For grammar, I want to add a note. The completion is a continuation of the prompt, because sometimes it would incorrectly dock points if the completion started off in a kind of grammatically incorrect way. So it would say, oh, the first sentence of the completion is, or the first sentence here is trailing off, or it's not starting correctly, and it didn't really understand that the prompt and the completion go together. And then for some of the creativity criteria, as well as some other ones, I think adding the phrase relative to the prompt will get better alignment between us. So for example, there's a creativity criterion that says the completion contains unique details to the story world. In a number of cases, Haiku considered something unique in the prompt, and it gave a good score about that. So I don't want it to give a good score just based on the prompt. So the completion being unique and giving unique, or sorry, the completion giving unique detail to the story world is relative to the prompt. If the prompt has a talking tiger and the completion has a talking tiger, then the completion does not contain unique details. But if the prompt has a talking tiger and the completion has a description of the tiger or a description of where the tiger is living, or the tiger's hobbies, that would be considered unique details to the story world. And then the story has a clear beginning, middle, and end appropriate to age level. I think should be reworded to the completion continues the prompt to create a story with a clear beginning, middle, and end. And the reason is that similar to the previous observation, Claude was sometimes giving higher scores or lower scores based on what the prompt was saying. So I wanted to not ignore the prompt because it still has to take the prompt into consideration holistically when evaluating the plot of the story. But I wanted to understand that it should only be evaluating how the completion creates the story based on the prompt. It should not be giving a high or low score based on just what the prompt contains. Okay, so that is it in terms of analyzing aggregate statistics, both for raw scores between manual scoring and LLM Judge, looking at alignment between me and the LLM Judge. Now I want to show some examples, and hopefully this will make more concrete some of the observations that I saw. So we're going to switch over to this screen. So we're going to look at 976. So here, this is the grammar category, and this is the criterion, dialogue, formatting, and punctuation. So here's the prompt. Where do we go when we're sick and need a doctor? Dad asked Emma. The completion is, I'm sorry, Mommy. I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't know what to do, she said. Her mommy smiled and said, It's okay, sweetheart. I'm glad you're safe. Now let's go home and have some fun. Emma hugged her mommy and said, Thank you, Mommy. I love you, Mommy. Mommy smiled and said, You're welcome, sweetie. I'm glad you're safe. So obviously, very incoherent completion with respect to the prompt, right? But that's not what we're assessing here. We're assessing dialogue formatting, where all the dialogue is correctly formatted. The punctuation is inside the quotation mark. The capitalization is correct. But the Haiku's score is not 1.0, which I think it should be. And Haiku's explanation is that the dialogue uses quotation marks, but there are inconsistencies. Some dialogue lines are not properly capitalized, and the punctuation is not always placed correctly inside the quotation marks. For example, I'm sorry, Mommy, I didn't mean to hurt you, I didn't know what to do, lacks proper dialogue formatting. In my opinion, it doesn't. I think that's fine. So, this is an example of where we didn't agree. Let's look at 9.7. Here, this is where I felt like I need to update the instructions so that it doesn't get distracted by other scoring categories. So here, what color do you get when you mix blue and yellow? The art teacher asked, is the prompt. And I'm just noticing that here it's not formatted correctly. And the completion is, the teacher smiled and said, I'm so proud of you. The teacher smiled and said, I'm so proud of you, etc. Right? So in terms of dialogue formatting and punctuation, this should be a 1.0, right? All the dialogue is correctly formatted and the punctuation is correct. However, here it says the dialogue formatting is extremely poor. While there are quotation marks, the text contains repetitive and nonsensical dialogue that does not relate to the original prompt about mixing blue and yellow. There is no coherent dialogue structure or meaningful conversation. I agree. That's correct. But that's not what we're evaluating here. We're evaluating that when there is dialogue, does the model generate that correctly, and does it format it correctly? So this should either be a score of 1.0, and actually now that I think about it, this should actually be a score of 0.5 with the repetition penalty. So I do want to be consistent about repetition penalties. I always want to penalize that, and I always want to penalize the end of sequence token being generated with a new story. So let's look at 1231. Here, there should be a repetition penalty applied. You can see there's a lot of repetition here. You're welcome, Mommy. I love you, Mommy. I love you too, Mason. I love you, Mommy. I love you too, Mommy. I love you too, Mommy, etc. And this is age-appropriate vocabulary usage. And it's right. It should give a 1.0 when looking at age-appropriate vocabulary usage. But since I want to apply a repetition penalty, this should be 0.5. Let's look at 505. This is an example where what Claude Haiku considered a unique detail, I didn't. So here we have this story. Jack and Sally were running through the woods together when they stopped suddenly. They heard a strange sound coming from around the corner. What's that? Asked Jack. Sally put her finger to her lips and said, Shh, let's go find out. Jack and Sally followed and the completion is other person to the other side of the woods. So Haiku says there are some unique details to the story world, such as the unspecified strange sound, which is in the prompt, and the mysterious other person, which is here in the completion. The children's quick transition to play and their emotional openness provide a slight sense of specificity. However, the details remain quite generic and lack rich, distinctive world building. That's the main takeaway. The details remain quite generic. I don't think other person is enough of a unique detail, so I think this score should be 0.0. And the strange sound was in the prompt, not the completion, so we shouldn't be scoring that. So that's where my additional instruction of, relative to the prompt will hopefully clear that up. On the flip side of things, when I considered there was a unique detail, Haiku didn't. So here we have, once upon a time there was a little girl named Lucy. She loved to explore the world around her, especially when it was bright and sunny outside. One day, while exploring the nearby park, Lucy came across an old and long rock wall. She was curious and wanted to get to the top, so she began to look around for something she could use to climb. Suddenly, she spotted a bright red button at the top of the wall. Excitedly, Lucy reached up and pressed the button. To her surprise, a bright light shone out the button, and a voice said, "Welcome to the world of adventure." Lucy couldn't believe her eyes, etc. "I'm the genie of the laser room. I'm here to grant you a wish," etc. The explanation for the 0.5 partial success score is that the laser room and the magical button introduce unique details to the story world. I agree. Give it a 1.0. The concept of a genie is unusual and creative. However, the details are not extensively developed, leaving the world building somewhat superficial. So this is where I think it's conflating plot with this creativity. And while it's not wrong, I only wanted to assess this criteria. So my additional instruction of do not evaluate any other aspect of the completion or of the story, other than the criterion provided, and the unique details to the story world relative to the prompt. I think those two might improve the alignment between me and Haiku. Okay, let's look at a few more. This is the reasoning test. So Ryan accidentally broke his sister's toy. When she saw it, she started to cry. Ryan felt sad and didn't know what to do. Just then Ryan's mom came into the room and said, "It's okay, Ryan, we can fix your toy car. We can fix it together." Ryan smiled and said, "Thank you, Mommy, I'm so proud of you." The moral of the story is that it's important to be kind to others, even if it's important to be kind to others. So I think, now looking at this, the repetition penalty would kick in. So I don't think I would have 1.0. I would say 0.5, but having a repetition penalty. So I think in this case, we agree. And yeah, no, I think this is good. The only thing I'll say about this one is that we just need this completion, right? We don't need this other 100 tokens. So the min length parameter, I think, really affects this. I think something that I want to think about in the future is that when I'm generating the prompt, I actually can't really give it an instruction when I'm generating. So yeah, that might be a future fine-tune, would be fine-tuning a reasoning and factual knowledge tiny model with a instruction where it says, you don't have to generate more than just the answer. So I'm going to switch this to agree. So that's going to boost my score a little bit. Next, we're going to look at 1201. Here we go. This is a grammar, age-appropriate vocabulary usage. "Where do we go when we're sick and need a doctor?" Dad asked Emma. "I'm sorry, Mommy, I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't know what to do," she said. Her mommy smiled and said, "It's okay, sweetheart. I'm glad you're safe. Now let's go home and have some fun." Emma hugged her mommy and said, "Thank you, Mommy. I love you, Mommy." Mommy smiled and said, "You're welcome, sweetie. I'm glad you're safe." So I consider this a 1.0. The vocabulary is simple and age-appropriate for the children's story using these words. Great. Stop there. However, the context and emotional content seems somewhat unclear or disconnected. That's not what we're evaluating. So hopefully the separation of concerns instruction will help. Next, we're going to look at 570. This is factual knowledge. What do we use to brush our teeth? Mom asked Johnny. Johnny smiled and said, let's brush our teeth. And that's a great idea. They brushed their teeth together. Let's do it again tomorrow. Let's do it again. So this was scored as 0.5 by Haiku. I would score it 0.0 because it does not contain the answer toothbrush. Maybe if there was toothpaste involved, which I think there was in another model's completion, I would give it 0.5, but here nothing is the answer. This one goes on about the generation focuses on the interaction, it's missing factual information, so it gets it. It misses providing the factual information, but I feel like all this other stuff is distracting Haiku from just focusing on this criterion. So I think, two thoughts. One, I think my focus when evaluating a criterion, just focus on it and ignore everything else. The other option, which I would rather not do because of the latency that would introduce, is that I might want to just grade one criterion at a time. So instead of grading one category per prompt, I might want to do one criterion per prompt. I'm certainly going to explore that if I don't get a 90% alignment, but I would like to avoid that because how I'm going to use this LLM Judge is I'm going to use it during training so I can track this performance and correlate it with eval loss and training loss. So this is something that is going to happen at least 20 times during a training run. It's already going to be a large, like a 4 or 5 hour increase in terms of the added time because of the latency that this introduces. If I split this into 18 prompts, and one per criteria across the 150 prompts, this is going to significantly increase the training time. So I'm going to have to balance latency with performance, and I already know I'm going to err on the side of I'll accept the lower performance of my judge if I can train a little faster. Okay, the last one is 584. Here's an example of the EOS token. So here it is. Here's end of text, and then it makes a new story. Once upon a time, there was a little boy named Timmy. So here, I would dock this one level. So it would go from partial success to failure because of the end of sequence token penalty. So here's an example of how that would kick in. So yeah, those are some examples to give you a sense of how I was learning about and refining my own scoring methodology, but then also seeing how Haiku is reacting to different situations to help me understand how can I better curate my prompt to suit Haiku's strengths while avoiding some of its weaknesses like the dialogue formatting and punctuation where it was just consistently failing to get that right. So my next steps are going to be redesigning the LLM Judge prompt, redesigning the criteria, moving things around, combining some criteria, removing some criteria, moving one criteria from context tracking to plot because it's better suited to be in plot. And then once I get those two things done, I'm going to rerun the LLM Judge and get my 1,350 scores, and then redo the LLM human alignment exercise. And so hopefully once I get that done and we look at those scores, all criteria should be above 90%, hopefully, or close to it. And when we aggregate by scoring category, all scoring categories should be above 90%. So if I hit those marks, then I will consider this a part of the experiment done. It's good enough for now. And now I can actually move into doing some training runs where I'm integrating this LLM Judge. So that's what's going to come next in this work. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.